All right. All right, thank you all for coming. I'm George Carlson, Director of the McLaughlin Research Institute, and what we have had here today is our National Development Council meeting, people who volunteer their time together with their board members to help support and get the word out about the McLaughlin Research Institute, and many of them are in the audience, as are our summer students and teachers. So if you just wave and let people know you're here. We have a real pleasure today to have Mr. Barry Petersen talk, and since I've known him so long, since yesterday, I can give a... But the thing is, I'm not going to introduce him. I'll let someone from Sidney, Montana introduce him, because that's where he is from. But when you read this book, you get to know, I felt like I've known him for years after reading Jan's story. It's such a compelling story. It's honest, and it gives a perspective to people that I don't think, unless you've lived through it, you can't understand. But to do the actual introduction, I'll introduce Jan Lapine from Sidney, who was, I guess, from what I've heard, is that her brother hung around a lot with Barry Petersen. And I don't know what they did.
It is with great honor that I have an opportunity to introduce Barry Petersen. I met Barry Petersen being the sister of a brother who was a friend with Barry. My family spoke very favorably of the Petersen family in Great Falls, or in Sidney, Montana. His father was well known, his mother, and of course he is a relative to, I think, the whole town of Sidney, Montana. And knowing that we all represent very small towns, everybody knows everybody. And Barry really began his career, we think, in Sidney, and if he didn't, we're going to own it. Barry wrote for the Sidney Herald. He wrote for the Sidney High School Spokesman, of which we did read. We didn't trash it. We actually read it. Barry also really began his career carrying the newspaper called the Billings Gazette. From there, because we grew such great talent in Barry, I'm sure, he went to Northwestern, where he completed a bachelor's and a master's degree in journalism, and from there did work as a news correspondent, and eventually many of us met him on the CBS News. As a child growing up in Sidney, Barry wasn't as much older than I'm 4 years younger than Barry. But my mother was a news junkie, so when Barry came on, the whole family went around the TV, and there was Barry reporting. My family also benefited from the fact that Barry was in Tokyo and in various locations with CBS News, and my niece who traveled abroad was able to meet Barry there as well. He comes to us certainly being a scholar in the field of journalism. He's won numerous awards. He's won the Emmy Awards for his work. He was one of the first ones to report on AIDS. If you have been around, and I'm sure that you have, you watched him do major reporting on Sarajevo, and also other opportunities that came along with him. Currently, he is working with Katie Couric, if you've seen him on TV, or his reports, and always Charles Osgood as well, of which on Sunday he did a profile that he will show with us today. I think what is lovely about what Barry now is doing is also profiling a part of a personal life that one hopes to never reveal, and that is being touched with the disease called Alzheimer's. And with his lovely wife as the subject of his book, he has come to us to provide another voice, not a research voice, but actually a voice of those who end up being the caregivers of those we love. And we will all be touched by that. So if you would help me, and with great pleasure, help us introduce Barry to Great Falls, Montana, but also welcome a Montana boy home.
This is going to be hard, so bear with me. People often ask me, what is the toughest story I ever covered? And I'm going to show it to you right now.
about this country's past.
She was lively, daring, one of those people who celebrates life.
Oh, here, give me that back.
No!
Oh, that's okay, you can keep it. Okay.
But at only 40 years old, the subtle changes began, the lapses in memory. 5 years ago, when she was 55, she received a diagnosis both awful and heartbreaking. Jan had Alzheimer's disease.
Let's go have a seat. Yes, you look, yeah, I'd say. I like people.
It has moved so fast that she is now in an assisted living facility where this once bright, articulate woman struggles to make sense.
How do you feel about being here? Well, mostly, I like people.
It can be painful to watch.
Say, if they said something first thing in the morning, first name, yes, coffee, yes. Oh, and that's good.
Judy Pring oversees the unit where Jan lives.
And I will go to get her for lunch, and she will be talking quite animatedly sometimes, and she's talking in the mirror. She's very concerned about whether or not the person in the mirror is going to come with us to lunch. She'll always say, "What about her?" And I'll say, "No, Jan, just you and I. We're going to go sit and have lunch together." "All right." And she'll say, "Oh, okay." And she'll always make sure she says goodbye to the person in the mirror.
For me, this is not just another piece of journalism. As I'll explain in a moment, it's personal. But to understand Jan's tragedy, you must understand what happens when Alzheimer's strikes one so young.
Alzheimer's disease is a condition that affects the whole way someone is. It affects their personality, it affects their behavior, it affects their thinking, it affects their memory, it affects their ability to speak.
Dr. James Galvin is professor of neurology and psychiatry at New York University's Langone Medical Center. He says most Alzheimer's patients are in their 70s and 80s, but it can also strike as young as 30 when it is called early or younger onset.
There are about 250,000 Americans who have the disease before age 65. These numbers will likely increase as doctors are becoming more and more aware of the problem and are better able to detect the disease at the earliest stages.
The first thing to know about Alzheimer's is that there is no cure. The second, there is no known cause. And even worse, says Beth Kohlmeyer, a senior director at the Alzheimer's Association,
there's no evidence that shows that you can prevent Alzheimer's disease.
Like you can't do a million crossword puzzles and that'll
Right now, what the research is showing us is that you cannot stop it by doing certain things.
And as baby boomers age, the problem will get far worse. Right now, some 5 million people have it. By mid-century, that number is expected to triple.
Every decade after 65, the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease roughly doubles, so that by age 85, approximately 50% of the population is affected.
And Dr. Galvin says that Alzheimer's lags behind other major diseases in research money, which may explain this. Deaths from heart disease, breast cancer, stroke are all down, but Alzheimer's-related deaths are up almost 50%.
For lunch afterwards, I'm sure will be about 10 to 11:30.
That reality haunts Pat Van Dyke on an outing to the Dallas Museum of Art. For people with Alzheimer's disease, she seems out of place, too young for an illness usually associated with old age. Her early onset was diagnosed 6 years ago at age 52. What do you think? What goes through your mind?
Disbelief. I mean, I was shocked. I mean, what can I say, I just shocked.
Still in the early stages, she stays active, hurriedly cramming in life experiences like cruises and trips to Europe.
I mean, every day I know, my time's getting shorter, and I just need to do everything I can while I can, enjoy it, enjoy life. And I do. I really do.
For Pat, the hardest part may be ahead. when the ravages of the disease will likely force her into a long-term care facility. And she says that she will not want visits from the granddaughters she so cherishes.
Because I don't want them to see me like that.
And why would you want them to not see you at some point? What is it you want to avoid here?
I want to avoid the later stages and
them seeing you.
Them seeing me, not knowing them, not recognizing them. I don't want them to see that I don't know who they are. I mean, that's very hard for somebody.
I just like people as normal people.
The future for Pat may look a lot like the present for Jan Charlton.
Darling.
As I mentioned earlier, for me, Jan's story is both personal and painful. A story this reporter never expected to tell.
Somebody I love.
Jan Charlton Petersen is my wife. Jan loved me without measure. She was all I wanted in this life. It was a love affair that had a beginning but was never supposed to end. That is what this horror of a disease stole and destroyed. Jan and I were married in 1985. CBS posted us to Tokyo and Moscow, on to London and back to Asia. One of the things I loved most about her was how she embraced each new city as a new adventure.
And I want to see him all the time because I never see him.
She did all that with a man who is now a fading memory, who lives for her in the third person.
And then sometimes when I get too teary, because I do love him, and I just couldn't do without him.
And no matter how often it happens, nothing and no one can soften the agony when she has no idea that the man sitting with her, holding her as tightly as I can, is that same Barry. What's his name?
Mr. Happy.
That's his name.
Yes.
When Jan was first diagnosed, I took care of her myself. As she got worse, I hired a live-in caregiver. And finally, when her anger and confusion were slipping out of control, I had to put her into an assisted living facility, where on each painful visit, I see the changes as she disappears a little more. A friend calls it grieving, like saying goodbye by going to the same funeral over and over again.
And it's really challenging to grieve someone that's sitting right in front of you. It's really challenging to grieve someone that you've just helped take a bath and get them dressed.
Because it's such a long process and a long road that a family travels down together. It changes family dynamics, and it takes away all our preconceived notions about how families should look and how they should function.
I think I'm going to be in his life.
Mm-hmm. And Jan will always be in my life. But life continues. I learned from Jan early on to treat each day as beyond value, which presented me with one of the most difficult decisions I've ever had to make when I met Mary Nell.
The reality is I am a widow. The reality is that he is married to a woman that doesn't remember him. And so we exist in our own universe of this very peculiar new American family.
Mary Nell lost her husband of 22 years in an accident. We now live together. And before you judge us harshly,
this truly is a case of having to walk in someone's shoes before you make a judgment about how you would react and respond in similar circumstances.
Hi, how are you? Somebody else to tickle.
Together, we visit Jan, and together, we watch over her. Mary Nell understood from the beginning that ours is a relationship of three, because it will always include Jan, the woman Mary Nell now calls her friend.
Well, when you meet Jan, you can't not love her. She is vivacious and open and warm, and if I loved Barry, I couldn't not love Jan.
And I vowed that Jan's life would not be lost in the wasteland of Alzheimer's, so I've written Jan's story. It is also a forewarning, because millions more may soon be on my same sad journey as Alzheimer's triples by mid-century. And this is your room. The Jan I knew is all but gone to me now, but I remember what she always taught me, to embrace life. And to do that, I must go on. So we have to I'm on the wireless now, right, Jim? It's going to be hard to get through this. And I got to tell you, I'd give anything not to be standing here. What did I do wrong?
It's powered on.
Hello? Okay, I'll stand over here. Let me say it again. I would do anything not to be standing here today. Because standing here today means that Jan is where you see her. I want to share with you some things from the book. I can't walk around because the mic isn't working. I want to read you a couple of things. I want to talk about it. I need to tell you first that I'm a total fake. I can talk to a camera that has 5 million people at the other end, but I'm terrified of talking to actual people. And I know that's, people keep saying, well, that's just weird, and I keep explaining to them that when you talk to a camera, I'm talking to a cameraman. It's like one person. Cameramen, in most cases, tend not to be critical and don't yell boo if I get something wrong. So bear with me. I want to read you some things from the book. We're going to take some questions and things of that sort. We're going to do a little test for you today. As you may or may not know, there is at the moment no definitive way to diagnose Alzheimer's. All the things we can see in the brain are part of the diagnosis, and one of the things they do is they give you a test across the desk. A neurologist sits across the desk and gives you a test. And one of the things the neurologist does is asks you to remember some words. We mentioned this at this, we had a little event yesterday at the book signing. The bad news is it's different words. So you're going to have to remember different words. What the neurologist will do is they'll ask you the words, see if you can remember them, and then go on, and then come back a few minutes later. And your ability to remember is a part of their ability to gauge the disease. 5 words: reality, awareness, guilt, love, and tomorrow. And that's your last chance. You know, I'm so glad we could show you the Sunday morning piece. And when I said it was the hardest thing I've ever written or done, it's true. I want to share just a little bit about Jan. Someone once said of great art that we do not own it. We merely take care of it for our lifetime, and then it is passed on to the next caretaker. When I fell in love with Jan, I thought it would be forever, but I was wrong. I merely had her for that time when she was passing through, touching lives, caring for others, and making me her life. Jan had a belief that we create our own happiness. When you wake up and face a day feeling that way, the days can be good, and hers were. And because of her, so were many of mine. You heard the conversation in the piece about what we don't know about Alzheimer's. Let me tell you a few things that we do know. At age 85, those of us who make it to age 85, half of us will get Alzheimer's. And you know what the other half are going to be doing? Taking care of us. If you think you have some immunity because you're young and healthy and jog, and do a million crossword puzzles, you're dead wrong as far as anybody can tell. And let me add one other thing. Jan's disease started, as best we can tell, when she was 40 years old. And George tells me today, who scared me even more, that sometimes some people, researchers, think 40 or 50 years it takes for the progress of this disease to go on before it can be diagnosed. The first stage of the disease, the Alzheimer's Association will tell you, is no symptoms, because we can't see it for so many years. Now, not a lot of people seem to have this disease when you rank it against everybody else in the country. 300 million Americans, 5.3 million, 21,000 in Montana, about 2%. So bear with me. I'm going to try something I've never tried before. I'm going to ask you to help me. I want everyone in the room who has a blood relative who has had this disease, a mother, a father, an aunt, an uncle, a brother, to raise your hand. Now just hold it there for a second. I would like those of you who have a spouse, an in-law, someone who isn't a blood relative, but someone that you know have the disease, raise your hand. And now, those of you who just have a friend, don't put your hands down. Those of you who just have a friend that you know has the disease or is taking care of someone with the disease or that you know about, raise a hand and look around this room. 2% of the population has the disease. Look at how many of us are touched by it. You know, it's one of the reasons I wanted to come and be here today, because we're here where people are actively fighting against this disease. You're going to hear from them a little later. They're going to tell you how they're doing. Not as well as we would have liked, but they're going to give us an update. Who remembers the second word? Thank you. There are two kinds of awareness that I wanted to chat about very briefly. One is the awareness that Jan had as the disease was unfolding. She knew when she was diagnosed what was happening. We knew what was going on. She knew she was going to fight it, those kinds of things. And then we hit this point in the relationship. For a while, and only for a while after the diagnosis, she was aware of her own confusion. He's going to fix this for me. Am I on? Is this on? Oh. Really? You sure? Can you hear me? Okay. For a while, and only for a while after the diagnosis, she was aware of her own confusion. She would say repeatedly, I know I have this thing in my head. Am I okay? Yes, darling, I would answer, using my matter-of-fact voice, hoping my calm tone would reassure her. I don't want to be a burden, she would repeat over and over again. I can just go away. Why don't I just go away? No, darling, I would say, I will take care of you. Wouldn't you take care of me? Yes, and the idea of being a burden would fade for a while. As the disease moved on, Jan lost that self-awareness. Now she thinks she's not have any disease. If you ask her, she says, I'm healthy as a horse. That's great. The bad thing is when she was fighting the disease, she wanted to take the medications that are available that help with the disease. Now she resists taking medications at all. By the same token, at least she's, comfortable and happy. I have a theory about Alzheimer's that I think you can help me to understand in your own minds. I think we all understand diseases that people get because we all have some sense of what those diseases are like. We've all suffered pain, whether it be having a disease or falling down, however you want to describe it. We've all had shots. People who've been in surgery have had IVs. We all understand that. I have never had cancer, thank God. I know people who have, and they discuss chemotherapy and how it makes them ill. Generally, people will say, it makes me nauseous. I'm nauseous for days. I've never had that, but I'm sure like you, I've had flu or colds or diseases like that where I've felt that, and I can imagine and be horrified at the idea of having this kind of feeling that way for days on end. So I have a sense of understanding of those diseases. The mind has no ability to imagine itself turning itself off. You know, the brain starts before we're born, and there are some people who think it actually goes on for a couple of minutes after we actually die. So the brain has no capability for us to understand, and we have no way to have an awareness of what this disease is. Next one, anybody? My least favorite one. When I placed Jan into an assisted living facility, her family was really upset with me. Now, we'd been living in Asia for a long time. They hadn't really seen her that much. I placed her in this facility, and something happened to them which had happened to me. Denial. You can imagine how this felt, and if you can't, you will in a second, I hope. They went to see her, and they saw Jan, who was cheerful and beautiful. That is how the disease works. It doesn't distort the body, and it can leave some traits alive, like Jan's smile and laughter. You saw that. If you aren't there at the bad moments, if you aren't there to agonize over another sign of deterioration, you couldn't see how much she had changed. Instead, you only see the person you remembered as if all of her were still there. And in that kind of denial, all you'd see is the lovely person who did not deserve being placed in a facility, and you would detest the man who did it. That would be me. I think that was one of the hardest things to deal with in dealing with this disease, is its sheer cruelty to fool people. They didn't want to see Jan not well. They didn't want to accept what Jan was going through, and they found a person that they could dislike, and that was me. And it was very painful, and I thought about it for a while, and I decided that if it helped to personify the evil of the disease, and if I was that person, I would accept that as a measure of how much they love Jan. That they could dislike me that much, I'm not that dislikable, truly. Then that to me said how much they missed her as I did. Let's talk about guilt for a second, because it really plays into this disease. Because you can't see it. Nobody loses a limb. Nobody loses weight. Nobody looks different. Nobody loses their hair with this disease. I covered a plane crash once. Singapore Airlines coming out of Taiwan, the middle of the night, a very bad typhoon. The pilot was anxious to get out, fully loaded, fueled for a flight from Taiwan to the United States. He turned on the wrong runway. He was in such a hurry. He made a mistake. Turned on the runway he shouldn't have turned on. Full power, off they go, without realizing that 2/3 of the way down the runway, they were actually construction cranes, because they were working on the runway. Tried to lift the plane, couldn't. Plane comes down. Now, I don't need to describe to you what it's like to have a fully fueled Boeing 747 come down on a runway. And I interviewed one of the survivors, one of the walk-away survivors, who walked away. He talked about the things he had seen when he looked behind him. I won't describe them to you, but suffice to say, people were strapped in their seat and there was jet fuel everywhere and the plane was on fire. And you know, his overwhelming emotion from this was guilt. because he had survived. That's how I feel most of the time. I know I will offend some of you when I say this because I'm not an irreligious person. I'm a Danish guy. I'm Lutheran. I went to church. I've done all of that. But there is a part of me that never stops saying that if God needed somebody to have Alzheimer's on that day, why didn't he choose me? Why did he take her? She was the good one. She was the bright one. I have no answer to that question. Only my anger. I think one of the things that you can see in my comments is what caregiving does to people. Most of you probably don't realize, unless you've come face to face with this, that in caregiving for an Alzheimer's patient, the caregiver dies first in many cases. Now, I thought that meant the 85-year-old wife who's taking care of her 87-year-old husband, but I was wrong. When I was taking care of Jan, I started to go down. The caregiver goes first. Somebody was telling me the other day that in Montana we have this great trait that we're self-reliant. You know, Montanans don't need help. You know, we can do it. And I will tell you, if you come across this disease and you're the caregiver and you think you're going to survive by being self-reliant, you will die first because it'll take you down. Your life will shrink. You will lose track of people who are around you because you'll stop going out. Your world will exist 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You won't know what the person's going to do, when they're going to do it, what hour of the night they're going to do it. You'll forget that there's a world out there, and that's how people go down. You're doing well so far. Next word. Okay, this is the one I'm not supposed to talk about. You're all grown up, so I'm going to have this conversation with you, but people have criticized me for talking about this. And I said to somebody, you know, the worst thing you can do to shut up a journalist is to tell him not to talk about it. What do you lose with Alzheimer's? Not just the person, but the person that you love and that you have love with. I think we're talking about sex here. I came to visit Jan at one point in her room. She came to me, and I looked at her. She wanted us to be together. I looked at her, and I thought she's like a child, lonely and so often scared, and I am not her lover. I am her caregiver. She was in bed. I got up and came around to her side of the bed to help her crawl in, pull up the covers, and kiss her as I prepared to leave. Her eyes sought my face. Do you know who you are? I asked. My name is Jan. Do you know who I am, darling? She looked at me as softly as she always had, but she couldn't answer. She had lost me. After I wrote this, I sent it to several people who read it, numerous people who actually made it much better, I got to tell you. One of them sent me back a very angry note who said, I shouldn't have discussed this, I shouldn't have shared this, I had no right to do this and to talk about this kind of a situation with Jan. And it was a very difficult letter to get, email, because this is someone who's known Jan for many, many, many years. 3 days later, I got a note from Edie Torgerson. Where is she? I don't see her. Oh, there she is. Probably the most profound thing I found in the book was the chapter on your feelings of intimacy with Jan as your wife. It has taken me a long time to understand how different I feel toward Al, her husband, who has Parkinson's disease, and admit to myself that it's okay and a part of the process. I offer this without comment or judgment, only to say it needs to be discussed. If you're dealing with someone in this situation, it needs to be Understood. You're coming toward the end of your test. You have one more word. I call Alzheimer's the disease, capital T, capital D. I capitalize the letters because to me it is a viable and known enemy. In my mind, I give it face and form. And one way to beat the disease is to keep going when the disease is taking Jan down and stretching its tentacles, trying to drown me as well. The disease and I both know this. It is the arena of our personal war. We talked a little bit up here about creating a different kind of family. Mary Nell and I, a family of 3, taking care of Jan. We've gotten a lot of response to that. One said, condemned you and the bitch you live with to rot in hell. My personal favorite on the other side was, no judgment here, dude. And he went on to say that they'd been married for 30 years and he'd loved every minute of it. I want to tell you 3 reasons that I wanted to talk with you and why I wrote this book. And it's available at the coffee shop or the bookstore or something. So that we're going to be there a little later. And if you buy one, I got to mention to you that 10% of the royalties go to the Alzheimer's Association. And I need to add that a person who shall remain nameless and anonymous sitting in the front row in a red outfit is going to match that donation dollar for dollar to the Colorado Alzheimer's Association. 3 things, not things, about the journey and the book, if you will. We will not, Mary Nell and I, end taking care of Jan. We will always watch over her. I will not let 2 lives be sacrificed to this disease. I lost Jan. I vowed it was not going to get me as well. And you're all welcome to have an opinion about that, trust me. I did not want, and I wrote this book, I did not want this person lost. She's far into the mist of Alzheimer's. She's in the fog. She was a wonderful, bright, amazing woman, and I am not going to let that disappear because of this disease. Now, I want to ask the people here from McLaughlin to stand up. Stand up. There's like 20 people in the audience here. Is that it? If you have some sympathy for what I have said, some understanding for what this disease has done, some idea of what I am going through, I ask you, if you wish to applaud these people, because these are the people who are fighting it. I salute you. Assuming I can stay with you long enough and not break it down into tears again, I would love to answer questions if you have them or gracefully depart the stage. Yes, wait, you need a microphone or something. Can you yell or? Can you pass that back? Oh. You have to use the mic because you're being beamed to faraway other places.
Actually, I'm accustomed to speaking in large auditoriums, so I probably don't even need it, but
nonetheless, I just have a comment. This is another personal experience regarding another disease, which is Parkinson's. And one thing that troubles me is that I knew somebody who passed away a couple of years ago, and not one out of some 50 neurologists ever mentioned the issue of late-stage Parkinsonism. Mm-hmm. And the late stage of Parkinson's is just as horrid as Alzheimer's.
Dementia and the whole thing, right, George? Yeah. Yeah. And I think Edie can share. I think Edie's going through that right now, and I suspect there are others in the audience who are dealing with that. Yes, ma'am.
What event finally forced you to make the decision
to put her in assisted living? Okay, the question is what event? I wish you hadn't asked that. Because it was my fault.
No, it's not.
Well, bear with me. You know, you have to realize we're living in Tokyo. We're kind of far away, so there's no support group. And we're also living in Beijing. I had this weird thing where I was covering both countries. We had apartments in both places. I had the arrogance to believe I could take care of her. And I did. And I'd call, if I was traveling, I'd call at dinner time, check the stove, make sure you're okay, things like that. And then it became apparent that this wasn't going to work. And I had a job where I could be called at any time and be sent someplace far away. So I hired a caregiver, a living caregiver, wonderful woman, a retired nurse from Tacoma, Washington, who came. She lived in the flat with us in Tokyo, and then we got her a place in Beijing, so she was a few minutes away. So whenever I was not there, it didn't matter. Jan had someone to take care of her. So Jan developed a problem. She wandered at night. She'd get up and go to the bathroom, and I'd say, where are you going? She'd say, I'm going to the bathroom. It'd be fine. I'd roll over and go back to sleep. But every now and then, with no warning and interspersed sometimes weeks apart, she couldn't speak at all. She'd be hunched over. She would be shuffling like this. And she had no sense of where she was. If she fell over, she wouldn't have put her hand out. She would have just fallen. I'd jump up, take her hand, lead her to the bathroom, bring her back, and really carefully put her back into bed. Well, the upshot of this is I'm working a day job and a night job. So I'm really working 24 hours. Every time Jan got up, I woke up because I didn't know if it was going to be that time or not. The woman who was the caregiver, Diane, who was a nurse, was watching me, taking my blood pressure, watching how I was doing, as well as watching how Jan was doing. One day, in a lovely Tokyo afternoon, she called me into the living room and sat down and said, we have to think about assisted living. And I said, why? And she said, because you're going down. Those were almost her words. And I think the reality was that I felt horribly guilty. I felt like I'd failed Jan because I wasn't able to keep up with this process of taking care of her. And that is the truth. I ended up saying, agreeing, accepting that we had to put her into assisted living because I finally understood, dense as I am, I finally understood that I was going to be one of those caregivers who might die first. And just to reinforce the point in this conversation, Diane said two things. First, the person with Alzheimer's is always taken care of. Someone will always look after Jan. No one looks after the caregiver. And then she looked me in the eye and said, and how are you going to take care of her if you're dead? So we decided and made that decision to do that. It was a huge sense of failure. It's hard to describe. I'm sure you have some sense of that. That I was the reason that we couldn't keep going in the situation that we had. But by the same token, I had to accept the fact that I couldn't take care of Jan if I wasn't around anymore. You ask tough questions. Anybody else? Please.
Barry, I wouldn't have known about your book or had a chance to meet you, I was indirectly associated with McLaughlin.
There you go. Keep going. It's fine.
And so, in opening your book last night and reading a little bit of it this morning, it's really a powerful, very good read, and I hope us who are in the audience and associated with McLaughlin leverage it and pass it around to the many people in our lives who are affected by it. So, because unless someone like Miss Oprah endorsed it, I mean, it's a very good message to circulate. So, congratulations thank you for sending the message out.
Thank you. I'm going to read you a line. Thank you for saying that. Then I want to share this with you because it brought it to mind, and I should have done it before. We asked really important people to write comments for the books, and then we also reached out to George. Yeah. And, you know, George said something that we thought was really amazing, and we've quoted him or misquoted him before, but it goes to your point. He said, it's impossible to read this book without wanting to fight this disease. As a laboratory scientist, it is easy to avoid confronting the personal loss experienced by the patient and family. There is no avoiding the personal effects of disease in Jan's story. So if I have spurred this man on in some way, or the rest of you who work at McLaughlin, then I did my job. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
So you said Jan has stopped taking her medication?
We kind of, and I probably shouldn't say it, we kind of give it to her and say it's calcium and we have yogurt and things like that, but there's some pretty strict rules about giving people meds and they're not being aware of what they are. We do give her, she's on Exelon, which is the last of the 3 medications that don't really stop the disease. I don't want to stop it because I don't know if it's helping or not, so why not give it to her? And that's pretty much all that she's on.
My husband is taking Aricept and
Right, right. And Namenda, Jan's on Namenda as well.
And so, you know, that's sort of like, how do you know when or when not to stop?
Let me ask you a different question. Her question is, how do you know when or when not to stop? Let me ask you a different question. Have you had the conversation with your husband about what's coming after? I didn't do this with Jan.
He really won't talk to me.
And most people won't, because most of us wait. I didn't wait too long. I waited so long I can't have the conversation. Do you understand what I'm talking about? The conversation. Every woman in the audience is going, yes, I understand. Every man is going, what's the sports score? Complete avoidance. It's scary. I never had the conversation with Jan to say, what is it we want to do when we reach the stage? Now, I know why I didn't do that. I didn't because somehow talking about that in the connection with this disease was like signaling defeat. And she wanted so much to fight it that it was my excuse to avoid having the conversation, and so I never did. And I say to people, if you take one thing from this book, have the conversation with the person you love before you reach the point where you can't have that conversation anymore. Somebody I talked to said, you know, the best time to do it is, Ashley, when are you getting married? Next Saturday. Stand up. Ashley's getting married next Saturday. How old are you, Ashley? 23. That is the perfect time to have the conversation. And I mean, you know, people say that. You know when most people have this conversation? When one of them is on a gurney outside the emergency room. That's when they talk about this stuff. When you're 23 and you're about to get married and you're really kind of talking about what life is in front of you, that is the moment to talk about these kinds of things. And you know, if I had done that, I would have had some guidelines for what Jan wanted and for what I should do that might follow in her wishes. But I didn't, and so I don't. And I really have to say to you, if you want to not make the mistake, have the conversation. Sweetheart, what do you want after I'm gone? Sweetheart, what should I do if this happens to you? Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. The response from the Sunday morning program, may you and the bitch you live with rot in hell. I will say I got 200 emails on the website for the book. Can I plug, is that allowed? www.barrypetersen.com, and I'm Danish and Montana, so it's with an E-N, okay? We got another couple of hundred people who responded to CBS.com, to the web thing. And they were interesting in the sense, I would say overwhelmingly, like 98 to 2, or 98% to 2%. We're talking 300, 400, 500 of these things. People were supportive. I salute Mary Nell, who by sheer accident has people from Quebec, Canada, telling her what they think of her life choices, and took it well. And the nice thing and we didn't really, trust me, we just kind of watched this unfold. On the CBS website, when somebody would be critical, usually 2 or 3 people would jump in and say, you don't know what you're talking about, you haven't walked in the shoes, you need to kind of back off. So I'm not suggesting that's a justification, because I've said this before and I'll say it again. This book is not a prescription. It's just one story. And it's just one view. And our decision is just the decision of Mary Nell and myself. I'm not trying to be out there and tell people this is how you need to live. But by the same token, it's nicer when they say no judgment, dude, than when they say burn in hell. So, but I think I was surprised that 98% of the people were incredibly supportive, and you would not believe the stories that people told me, about what's happening in their own families. Somebody said to me, my mother has Alzheimer's, and she's 82, 86, 94, whatever. My father has Alzheimer's. And then they would say, but it's not like what you're going through. And I would say, the cruelty of the disease is that no one should ever stand in front of their mother or their father, look into the face of the person who gave you life and raised you, and see nothing there, that they don't remember you. I can't think of anything more cruel than that. It's exactly what I'm going through. So I think that anybody who's dealing with this disease is dealing with this absolute horror. This thing that stalks us. Yes, ma'am.
Barry, what?
She actually went to high school with me. She's going to reveal significant personal details, none of which are true. So, okay.
That's actually why I raised my hand.
That's right.
No, I do have a question. You said that you would have liked to have brought this up to Jan.
Yes.
When would you do that? Because the difficulty, in her early 40s, she's changing.
She started changing when she was 40 years old. Yeah. I mean, really tiny little things.
Prior to that, there would have been no reason,
No.
young and youthful.
Yeah. And that's when, go ahead.
The fear of bringing that up to someone you love, it's like, is he telling me I'm not all right? What you know now from when Jan started changing, when would you have chosen to bring that up? In her 40s?
I wish that we had the conversation when we got married. I wish we talked about it on our honeymoon. I mean, seriously, because, and I say that because there are times when you can have the conversation and it's not loaded emotionally. It's not easy anytime. It's difficult. Well, what are you going to do if something happens to me? Well, I'd like you to do this, or do you want to keep me alive? Do you want to go through these extraordinary measures? We all know the drill. We've all seen enough Hallmark movies to get this, truly. But it's a conversation that after she was diagnosed became so hard because she was so anxious to fight it. Why stop that process by having a conversation about what comes next? And I couldn't do it, and I should have. There are many things I should have done. Of the many things I should have done, I still think that's the biggest failure on my part. And I don't know when you're 26, right? So, well, Jan said she's 4 years younger than I, so that makes her 36. I don't think it matters at any stage. I really don't. I think just if you talk about it and you say, what is it we want for each other if we're in this situation? Mary Nell is a financial planner, and she says that she is consistently faced with people who come in talking about their estate, what's going to happen after I die and that kind of thing, and they have a similar attitude. I'm going to go from life to death, like that, without the realization that there can be a long, difficult, bad period in between, and they don't want to think about that or talk about what that means. I don't want to. I mean, when it comes to denial, you read this book, I am the chief of denial, trust me. I just want other people to know that should something happen, you will feel so differently that you talked about it and knew what it was. And I think Jan's family would have been far happier with me if I could have said to them, this is what Jan wants, and not this is what Barry thinks that Jan wants. So one more question, and then we have to give it over to the experts. Please.
Barry, I'd like to shift for a moment to shift gears a bit, maybe from the personal to the national. In the last year, we've gone through a divisive national debate on health care. You've spent your life covering very difficult issues around the world in some detail.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that 3 times as many of this population will have this disease in 40 years, and the cost of this nation to bury that. Do you have any observations or comments on, is there any connection in your mind about health care vis-a-vis the disease?
Did you all hear that? The health care vis-a-vis the disease? I do. You're in a ton of trouble. 300 million Americans, 7 million roughly, have long-term disability insurance. 7 million. Now, I know that in this part of Montana, people are truly rich, so this is not going to bother you. But if you put somebody into assisted living, think about this for a minute. If you need to put somebody into assisted living, you're really talking $70,000 to $100,000 a year, or more. And if you think you can pay for that, everybody in this room, look into your wallet and think, where am I going to get $100,000 or $70,000? If you think Medicare is going to help you, you're wrong. Medicare does not pay for long-term care. Now, if you go broke, if you spend all your money, if you sell everything, and you are at the point of destitution, then you qualify for Medicaid. But we live in a fool's paradise because we keep thinking that we're not going to have to deal with this because it's not going to happen to me. But I take you, go back one more time. 2 things to keep in mind. Where in the hell are you going to get $100,000 a year? I know you make a lot of money, so you don't care. But think about what we earn. I mean, think how much money you make. And $100,000 is like, you got to make $150 after taxes. So you're like $150 down right from the outset. And that's who said that? 1 year. Then there's the next year and the year after. But let me put it another way. If you think that you're going to be okay because you're not going to get Alzheimer's, then let me recast the question, because when 15 or 20 million people have this disease and they are going broke so fast, we don't know how to deal with it. You know what's going to happen? We're going to have a national debate about taking care of people. And when we have that debate, because of who we are and the kind of people we are, we're going to want to do that. And that means that if you don't pay for it personally out of your own pocket, Uncle Sam will have to come and ask for help. We have no plan for this, no plan. And it is the tsunami that's coming at us. And somebody told me the other day that it's going to cost us between now and 2050, $20 trillion. Now, we all were harassed about the big bank bailout for what, $1 trillion? We thought that was horrific. Times 20 is what we're going to face to deal with this disease. Unless the people that you hear from now, because I'm going to be done, can stop it somehow. Does that answer your question? Thank you very much. Thank you. The people from McLaughlin have arranged to have a ton of books at the
hospital gift shop, which is down the corridor that way on this floor.
So after the seminar thing, I'm going to walk down, and I'd be glad to sign books. You have to actually pay for them, unlike the lecture. So he offered me 20% of the take of the front of the house. Then he told me nobody paid anything. So.
And there's a reception as well after this short scientific panel.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm going to get out from under all of this.
And thank you again. I think everyone appreciated that. And Teresa. So what I'll do is we're getting a couple tables out for the panel members. I'll introduce them depending on how far away they are. I'll start with Dr. Irv Weissman, who is the chairman of our scientific advisory committee, but more importantly, only a little bit more importantly, he is the director of the Stem Cell Institute at Stanford University and a professor of pathology and developmental biology, and our first high school student at the Institute. No, I was born when you were a high school student, but... And so Irv is a leading stem cell scientist, as is our next panel member, Ann Tsukamoto Weissman, who is the executive vice president for research and development at Stem Cells Incorporated. She was a postdoc with Harold Barmas, who had a Nobel Prize. I didn't know her then, even though I was... No. I was already had a faculty position when you were doing it. And then Deb Cabin, who's the assistant professor at the Institute, and she joined us from the National Center for Genome Research, and she got her doctorate at Johns Hopkins. Teresa Gunn, who's our newest faculty member, and got her doctorate at UBC, then went on to postdoc at Stanford University, just down the hall from Irv's lab. And all these people work on, their research is relevant to Alzheimer's disease. So one of the things I'd just like to stress before we start, we're going to try to be, if any of us use a word that you don't understand, throw something. Okay? So.
Yeah, sure.
So we're doing basic research, and we're doing research on mice. We don't deal with people. Irv does. He's the only MD in the bunch. But we don't give medical advice. Let me escape here. If I can. Here we go. All right. So what the purpose of this is, the purpose of the Institute is we try to use mouse genetics, nice simple animals, to try and understand the biology of the disease. And the current research emphasis of the Institute is on these degenerative diseases of the brain, where brain cells die. And so we're going to discuss the approaches we take at the Institute very briefly, and with an emphasis on the mouse models. But I'll give a brief overview if I can. You can see that my desktop is not the best. I got a lot of stuff on it. Well, those don't count. Those don't count. Well, I'm not going to put up that slide if I can't find it. So what I'll do is just talk about it. So, since they're mice don't undergo the same type of changes that people do when we don't even know if they have a dementing illness. So you don't have their cage mates saying this mouse is no longer normal. Their parents don't worry about their offspring. So we rely on changes in the brains of patients and see if we can reproduce those similar changes in the brains of our mouse models. And so there are only three things you have to remember. First is senile amyloid plaques, which are just these starchy deposits in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. There are tangles, which are fibers that are formed inside the brain cells of Alzheimer's patients. And the third is brain cell death. The brains of Alzheimer's patients actually shrink because the cells are dying. Now, most cases of Alzheimer's are of unknown cause. No one knows why someone gets Alzheimer's and other people don't. But there are very rare families where onset is very early and it is passed on from generation to generation. So you could have an early onset patient who gets disease at age 40 or 50. Half of their children will get disease at age 40 or 50. So that's a familial form of Alzheimer's disease. And defects in any one of three genes, this is very rare, again, these families are very rare, cause Alzheimer's disease. We don't know how, but what this does is give it a handle, a way that we can look at the disease process using the rare to study the much more common sporadic disease. Now, these three genes that are defective in these rare families all seem to have a common effect. They all raise a tiny little fragment of protein gets higher in the brains of these patients. No matter which one of the three genes is defective, and it leads to the full cascade of the amyloid senile plaques, the tangles, and brain cell death. So I will let Deb or Teresa talk about what a mouse model is and who's doing it. You are. Teresa. You can do either. You can do whatever you can stand up.
Okay, so at a very basic level, mice are a good model system because they are small, that we can breed them and have lots of them. They're not too expensive, so we can do big studies. People have been using mice to study genetics for over 100 years, actually, and so a lot's known about mice. We can make what we call inbred strains of mice, where within a strain, it's like the mice are all identical twins. They're genetically identical to each other. We can take mice and put a human gene into the mice. So, for example, if there's a particular gene that we know a particular form of that gene can cause Alzheimer's disease, we can put that gene into mice to try to make a mouse model of Alzheimer's and say, if people with this version of this gene develop Alzheimer's, what happens if we put that into mice? Can we cause mice to have Alzheimer's disease? And one of the reasons that mice are a good way to model disease is that they are mammals, so they have a mammalian central nervous system and brain. because the way you can have mice that are all genetically identical to each other, if you have a genetic cause for a disease, then you can study any mouse from that strain at any point in time and know that it represents all the other ones. And so you can, for example, say if they do develop a disease at a certain age, if you look at them at a younger age, you can try to find things that start to go wrong before they actually have the disease. So like markers of disease people talk about. And even though that mouse doesn't have a disease yet, it's genetically the same as all the other ones. So you know that if you didn't, sacrifice it to look at its brain and it lived for a few more months, it definitely would have gotten disease. And that's also important if we want to start trying to try out treatments or preventive methods to have a population of animals where you know they're going to get the disease. Then if you try a treatment and you see something change, it's because of the treatment. Did I forget anything? I guess the other thing about mice is that, obviously, unlike people, we can take them at some point and look at their brains, so we can dissect the brain out and look at proteins. And obviously, that's something that, we're not going to do to people. And so it gives us a different access to different information than we would get if we were just studying the disease in human populations.
Question.
Yes.
Cadaver. Can they check those when they die?
So the question was about using human cadavers if you have someone who had a disease, taking their brain post-mortem. You can, but you lose some information. As soon as the body dies, a lot of the things in the cells that make up the tissue start to deteriorate. And so if you don't get the tissue very quickly, you don't know if what you're looking at is part of the disease or something that happened after death before you actually collected the tissue. So you can get information that way, but you have to know sort of what happened before you got the tissue and what kind of quality it is. And obviously at that point you're just getting end-stage tissue. You can't start to look at things before they get the disease to see if you can identify a marker that could be used to develop a test, for example. Or
what if that person did have Alzheimer's?
If they did have Alzheimer's, well, ideally for any kind of study you have affected and control. So it's good to have, if you have someone with Alzheimer's, you can control them, compare them to someone who didn't, and look for changes. But again, if they've had Alzheimer's for 20 years and then they died, there's the initial thing that went wrong, and then there are probably lots of other things that, there's the initial thing that caused Alzheimer's that led to the cells in the brain dying and to cause all the parts of disease. So you're only seeing the end result. It's like if you have a cake that's baked and somebody asks you to try to figure out what's in the cake, it's a lot harder once it's all mixed together and cooked to figure it out. That's probably not a good example, but I'm sorry, that's the first one that came to my head.
And now Dr. Kavanaugh, I think, used the Parkinson's model as an example of a successful model. And then I'll have the bad news.
So Parkinson's disease, as was mentioned by an audience member, does progress to dementia if the person lives long enough with it. And again, it's a slowly progressive disease, so we want a good animal model to test drugs on, since the mouse lives a shorter lifespan and we can breed many, many identical mice. If we have a good model, be useful for testing drugs or other therapies that'll stop the progression if we can mimic the early stages of the disease. And I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the saga of getting a good Parkinson's disease model, which is sort of similar to some of the steps that the Alzheimer's community is going through. We first have to try to get a handle on a cause, and since most cases are sporadic and of unknown cause, maybe genetic and environmental interactions, we go to rare familial forms. Although there are toxins that will affect part of the brain that's affected in Parkinson's disease, those mice are only useful for studying replacement therapies. They don't slowly progress. They don't affect all the parts of the brain affected in Parkinson's. They don't develop dementia in the long run. So we started with a gene that's defective in very rare human cases of Parkinson's. And we took the easy step of putting it into all the nerve cells. Well, it does have an effect, but in the wrong part of the nervous system. Still informative, we have some information about what part of those nerve cells are affected first. We can look at how that gene causes those nerve cells to go bad, but it's not a good model. We wanted then to make it expressed only in the proper places in the brain, and we used a few genetic tricks to do that. We got it properly expressed, and we see changes very, very late in the lifespan of a mouse that are similar to what we would expect early in Parkinson's disease. So then we put in a defective form of that human gene and expressed it only in the regions affected in Parkinson's disease. And we're starting to see changes in the gut, in the brainstem, in the enteric nervous system. Early signs of Parkinson's disease are there. Okay, but right now we're trying to make a third stage of these models in which we up the level of this protein so that in the lifespan of a mouse we see the full progression of that disease. Now, the mice we have right now may be very useful as we completely define all the changes in them for testing drugs that will block that early stage of the disease, and those would presumably block later diseases. But ideally what we want is something that shows the full progression of the disease. That we're still working on, that we have some ideas about how to do this. Now, every stage in this process, every generation of models takes a couple of years to generate and fully analyze. So it seems like a very, very small, slow steps until somebody comes up with a more clever idea. But we've seen progress over the last 10 years, I think important progress. And until somebody comes up with something faster and cleverer, I think the mice we have right now are going to be important in looking for treatments. And hopefully the stage we're analyzing right now will be yet another step forward. Incremental perhaps, but over the years they add up. And using the mice has allowed us to make much greater progress than if we were only studying human tissues and examining progression in humans. In Parkinson's, there are brain scans that allow us to sort of follow progression of the disease once it's been diagnosed. That's not the early stages, but once it's been diagnosed. But following patients for years versus following a mouse for 2 years, it lets us get ahead a lot faster. Okay. Oh, sure. Yep.
So I understand the mouse model for testing new therapies because you've got some phenotype like the disease you're trying to study, and you'll be able to see whether or not the drug arrests that progression. But is it important to know at some level, I mean, in a way it's kind of an artificial thing because you don't know exactly whether or not the changes you made are the cause of humans.
Okay, I didn't go into this in great detail, but there are several genes that are known to cause Parkinson's. There are other ways of causing the motor symptoms that are seen in Parkinson's, like trauma to the brain. Muhammad Ali is a good example. That's probably not like sporadic PD. But the gene I'm interested in is linked to sporadic PD because it shows up in the brain on autopsy. It's part of the pathology. It's clearly the best gene link to sporadic disease.
And is it possible that in, like Alzheimer's, it's really like a lot of different diseases?
Okay, whatever part of the brain you hit will give you the same symptoms. So if I'll use a very technical term, dopaminergic neurons will give you the motor symptoms in Parkinson's. Cortical neurons lead to dementia. You can kill those neurons in many different ways. As I said, Parkinson's can progress to dementia, and that's linked to alpha-synuclein. There will be my genes deposit in the cortex in those patients. So there are a lot of ways to kill a particular population, and the readout is a particular symptom. So we think using the gene of interest in our transgenics is a good handle into sporadic PD, better than some other ways. There are drugs that kill that population of neurons, but it's fast, it's not progressive, it doesn't progress to cortic dementia, it doesn't affect the enteric nervous system, the gut. Yes?
Can you explain when you use the applied research that you're doing and apply that to the human population?
We're not doing that yet. We're still very, very basic and still analyzing our latest generation of transgenic animals. But then NIH has a bank of chemicals that are available for testing as therapies, and Harvard has a bank of chemicals. And once we have this mouse model fully analyzed, it's easy enough to get in a collaboration with people who will test all sorts of chemicals on those mice.
So the research that you provide here then goes to the high.
We'll go out. I'm not a chemist. I'm not a chemist, and I'm not a pharmacologist. But we can collaborate with those people who are begging for animal models to test all their compounds on. Any other questions?
Does it work? I just wanted to add that the animal models are good not just for making a model and then testing, does this cure it, does that cure it? The other thing about a lot of these genes that have been identified, and then the fact that a lot of the time, like with Alzheimer's, there aren't identified causes, we really don't know what's going on, is that the underlying biology, what goes wrong in the brain or in a cell in the brain to cause the disease, isn't well known. And a lot of what we're doing is aimed at understanding that, because really you can't come up with effective treatments or try to prevent it until you understand how it's being caused. And so a lot of what we're doing is really at that basic level, just trying to understand what is going wrong, and why do you is it just because all these genes can kill this same part of the brain and that causes the same symptoms, or do these genes do something similar to each other and that's why they all kill the same part of the brain? And so a lot of what we're doing is that, but we're doing the really early stuff that will hopefully lead to doing the later stuff.
Okay, now we'll talk about our Alzheimer models, which are very disappointing. We started doing this, I think we made our first one in 1985 or 1986, put in overexpressed amyloid precursor protein, which is where the little plaques come from. And we have not been able to reproduce these three hallmarks of disease by putting in one gene, an effective gene that definitively leads to all these three manifestations of Alzheimer's in humans, does not do the same thing in mice. We can make mice with one of those defective genes that gets amyloid plaques, those deposits in the brain, all over the place. And they have mild, very, very mild behavioral impairments. A human with those impairments would be considered normal. They're so subtle. We can make mice using another system that have tangles in their brain that look exactly like Alzheimer's patients. It's actually a different disease that's very similar, another dementing illness, frontotemporal dementia, and where brain cells die. Here's an Alzheimer brain on your right, which you can see is shrunken, is smaller than a normal brain slice on the left. So we can make tangles in brain cell death, and we can make amyloid plaques in mice, and we can cross those two different models together, or three different models together, and get mice that mimic these end-stage aspects of disease. This isn't somebody who's demented, would have all three of these. And we can't trigger that with a single gene that's sufficient in humans to cause the disorder. And so that's really the bad news. And we're working very hard to get this, but at the same time, what I think we have with that mouse, I think we know what the mice are telling us, is that these amyloid plaques, these senile deposits, are irrelevant to the dementia and the disease. They're tombstones. It's just an effect of the disease process. But what we have with these mice, because we know they're going to develop these plaques, and if we could get them to develop the others, it would be even better. but we have a preclinical animal. So if you think about it, if Alzheimer's is a disease that takes a long time to develop, there's small accumulated changes over time. And when would be the best time to come in for treatment? At this very early stage when there are no symptoms. So if we can identify people who are destined to develop Alzheimer's, we could then start developing more effective preventative measures. Because the comment on the cost is just phenomenal. So you don't have to cure Alzheimer's. If we could identify susceptible people, intervene and delay Alzheimer's by 5 years, 10 years, you'd be saving trillions of dollars in future medical cost, not to mention the more important agony. So that's a big part of what we're doing now. We've done this for another disease with Lee Hood at the Institute for Systems Biology to look at very early changes that occur before an animal gets sick that we could use as markers. And we're using these different models now to try to develop markers that will distinguish among different dementing illnesses early, as early as we can before the diseases manifest, and when you have the best chance of success. Now, the exciting new area for research is Irv lab and Ann's lab, where some of Ann's things with stem cells are actually in trials, not for Alzheimer's disease, but it shows how stem cells can be successful, at least in mice and hopefully we hope in humans, at treating brain disease. And I'll turn it over to either Irv or Ann, who...
So, the brain has many functions. You know when you have paralysis or epileptic fits that you're dealing with parts of the brain that are the motor cortex, and we share that completely with all animals. You know that when you lose perception, sight, hearing, taste, smell, pain, again, these are shared among all animals. What makes humans unique is that they have a mind as well. And Alzheimer's, from the beginning, is a disease of the mind. Manic depressive disorder is a disease of the mind. Schizophrenia is a disease of the mind. Autism is a disease of the mind. So the question needs to be, how does the brain make the mind? So that's just opening up. The problem is, to quote my high school teaching and most of your high school teaching, is people in the field like to be very dogmatic, to develop what's called conventional wisdom. When I was in high school, I was told that at age 13, I had all the brain cells that I ever would have, and that every drink I took after that, it was going down. And every one of you were taught that. But that was baloney, or I could use the other word for it. It was baloney because the conventional wisdom held sway. People only looked at fixed tissue sections of the brain, and they didn't think of the brain as a dynamic apparatus. So in the mouse brain, there are two places where you're making tens of thousands of new neurons every day. And neurons are the cells which are capable of making electrical connections with other cells, and the combinations of connections they make, along with the perceptual inputs of pain, sight, hearing, and so on, allow you to create. And what you create first is short-term memory. Now, in the part of the brain of the mouse that allows it to deal in life mainly with smell, you make tens of thousands of new neurons, and they go from one part of the brain down a predefined tract to another part where they aren't smelling, but they receive the input from our nose of what's called odorant receptor cells, or cells that can sense a particular odor. They're displayed all the way across our nasopharyngeal cavity, and so you can locate it, you can have time, and you have the input, and so on. But there's a much more interesting and important one, because actually we have little tiny parts of the brain that deal with smell. But the other part, and I apologize for the term, is called the hippocampus. I can't even tell you why it's called the hippocampus. But it has a part of that which in every person in this room is making new neurons every day. And the neurons that are made go down a predefined track. And as they go down the track, they send out connections, and they connect with the high wires of the brain that had been connected before. And actually, each new cell competes for connections with the cell that was made 10 minutes before. And if you lose that, you lose the ability to create short-term memory. I talk to you, I look at you, I look away, look back. I don't remember because I can't put it all together into short-term memory. The function of all those newborn neurons in the dentate gyrus, the tooth-looking gyrus curve, in the hippocampus is short-term memory. And it's complex because any single memory is everything that's happening to you at the moment. So now we're starting to get into the first idea of how the brain makes the mind. Well, those cells that are doing this are stem cells of the brain. And so the definition of a stem cell is when it divides to make two cells, one is still a stem cell, and the other one is starting to go down the path to make a short-term memory. Now, as you might imagine, if you've got to have high-wire connections, from the moment the cell is born until it actually can make connections is 3 or 4 weeks. So the cell that's born today won't participate in short-term memory until 3 or 4 weeks later. Then it starts to make and solidify the connections that bring together all the complexity of the situation so you can remember it without thinking about it. Those cells, now we know, are driven by particular proteins or what we call signal pathways in the cells. One of the interesting ones, just as an aside, is called the Wnt beta-catenin pathway. And it doesn't make much sense when I say it, but a long time ago there was a drug found empirically that took people out of the depressive or manic phase of manic depressive disorder, lithium. And lithium functions to activate the Wnt beta-catenin pathway, which is involved in newborn neurons in the brain that are going on to make memory. So now you can start piecing together each of the parts. I've always wondered why a genetic disease might wait 30, 40, 50 years to show itself, right? And because the genes are the genes. They're on or off, right? It should be right away. Teresa didn't say that. She said, you got to get accumulation of things. Well, we now have a really good understanding in the blood-forming system of how that works because it's embedded the change in a blood-forming stem cell. So it is a daughter cell that's like all the other cells except for one thing. And then it grows and grows and grows, and one of it makes a change, and now it's two things in that clone of cells, and so on, and so on. Now, what Isabel Bierman and I did and published, Isabel Bierman's from Power. She's a graduate of the McLaughlin Research Institute from George's lab. She's at Harvard doing the final years of her training. She's working with one of my former trainees who's a professor there. And we got together on an experiment. We asked, are all blood-forming cells the same as each other? And the answer is no. we're actually born with a diversity of them. And some of them are well suited to being active when you're young, and others are much better suited for when you're old. And the body kind of selects, just like Darwinian selection acts on individuals. It's survival of the fittest. And the fittest brain cell, or the one that, according to its own parameters, is fittest, beats out the others. Well, we already know from Rusty Gage that those newborn brain cells also have survival of the fittest. They're competing with each other all the time. So now we have an idea from another stem cell system that you can start to accumulate damage. You have a diversity. They're not all the same, those stem cells, even probably brain stem cells. So I think the magic moment for us came when we were able, Anne and I and Nabucco Uchida and a few others, to participate in the first time being able to grow human brain stem cells. And I'll offend a couple people. They came from fetuses. They could have come from adults, but you don't have much access immediately after death to adults. Just a fact. You pointed out, what about the dead person? Well, I would say it should be a national movement that we sign a statement that say, before I'm dead for 2 hours, the medical research community has access to every tissue in my body, because you have the accumulation of all those changes in your blood-forming system, your lung-forming system, your heart-forming system, and your brain-forming system. And if we could capture the changes that had occurred with life and grow the cells, that would be great. Well, we did grow the cells, and we put them, nobody will be surprised to hear, in the brains of mice to see what they did. We did them in mice that were like Bubble Boy. They had no immune system. And the astonishing thing is they took. And they took in exactly the place that mouse stem cells take. They divided where mouse stem cells divide. They track all the way down through parts of the brain exactly like mouse stem cells do, changing themselves into neurons, astrocytes, and the wrapping cells. And even a year later, they're still doing it. So now we have a huge chance for a breakthrough. We can study mice that have the genetic disease, and if they're immunodeficient, we can put in human cells that have the disease. And now we've got the infrastructure and whatever is intrinsic to the stem cells. And we can start to look at different ones. Now, there's another trick that's come out from stem cell biology. You can take part of the skin, and you can convert it directly to a very early embryonic stem cell from which you could get brain stem cells at an embryonic stage of development. But a new fellow at Stanford, Mario Zornig, who is collaborating with George at least, and I think to you guys, has just found a way to convert skin directly to neurons. So now there's a way to take cells from somebody genetically susceptible to Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, who have the whole collection of genes, or maybe N-1 of the collection, and start putting those cells in. So there's going to be a robust interaction continually between those of us at a medical center who have the patients in for the disease. We get samples of the cells, we make brain stem cells from them, or if there's a rapid collection of cells after death, the actual end of the process. So I'd say it's incredibly encouraging. Like everything, though, it takes time. And a lot of people say, well, I don't want to do it if it takes time. I mean, I don't want to invest anything that's not going to give me a 3-year return. That's what's called venture capital, or should I say, lack of venture capital. Investment banking is gone from the field. Big Pharma says, sure, we'll do it if it's a drug that you remember to take every day. But don't tell us about transplanting cells to treat a disease. So unfortunately, when you're in this business, and if you're in it, as I said to you guys a month ago, you have to build every step of the way yourself. Are there any questions before I...
Is early onset different from late onset?
You're asking the wrong guy. George will
The
know.
pathology, as far as we know, the pathology is different. It's that the early onset in most cases, it's relatively rare to have early onset disease, and they're even rarer are these families that have inheritable Alzheimer's disease. But as far as we know, if you were to look at the brain of the deceased patient, they would be sporadic. 85-year-old onset would look the same as a young onset person. That doesn't mean they're the same disease. They look the same. And that's why an animal model would be so important to have, because you don't know. You're looking at somebody who's at the end stage of the illness.
Progress of the disease any different as far as you know?
As far as I know, there's not much difference in the progress. It's just that the age of onset is earlier. Every individual, as you heard before, there are aspects. Every individual has a different personality, and they're different individuals. And Alzheimer's patient, each individual is a different person. They lose their self-awareness and identity, but what they were when they were healthy, fragments of it persist, which I think was brought out so well that that's one of the reasons it's so hard.
Are there new drugs in the pipeline that are promising from Big Pharma?
Not that I'm aware of, and part of the reason for that is the lack of a good animal model. One of the ones that was promising was developed with using the model that Karen Ash and I collaborated on, was using immunization, a vaccine against Alzheimer's disease. And unfortunately, when treating patients with that, it turned out that that caused inflammation of the brain and death. But as far as I know, there's nothing promising. One thing with these models, though, and what I think would be encouraging, is you have the opportunity, if you have these models and can understand early changes, what would be the most promising when you talk about Big Pharma hating it, if you could have an over-the-counter drug or a herb or something that would be not patentable or the patent is expired, that would be the ideal. Identify people who are going to be tracking, have a simple treatment that will delay or prevent the disease, or you have to do what Ann has done for a different disease.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we use the animal models to advance at least the stem cell therapy to clinical trials. And as Irv mentioned, I work for a small biotech company in California called Stem Cells, Inc. And with the platform technology that Irv developed in his lab to identify and purify stem cells, we've applied that to the human system and have identified the human brain-forming stem cell. And we have created the methods to grow them into large cell banks so that we can take one tissue, create a bank of cells, so that we can transplant these cells into many patients. We have done this for now 2 diseases. They are both rare and fatal genetic diseases. They affect children. And we are currently in clinical trials testing these cells. Now, the challenge is just like with Alzheimer's, these 2 diseases cause a degeneration of the brain so that the children lose all of their nerve cells. But because nobody has ever transplanted, purified, expanded brain cells in culture, you have to proceed cautiously to clinical trials. And so you have to take the mouse models, for example, that the panel has talked about, where you really look at the effect of what you're testing. So, for example, we took these brain stem cells and we transplanted into a mouse model that had the equivalent disease of the human diseases that we were trying to treat. It's a long road because you have to create an animal model that accepts the human cells. So you're putting human cells into a mouse, and then you have to show that you can protect the nerve cells that are in the brain of these animals. And so we've done this successfully for a disease called Batten's disease, and a disease, we're currently in trial, we've done this in another disease in animal models, where they lack the insulation of the nerve cells and causes the nerve cells to die. Now for us, the excitement of what we've done to date in these very rare and fatal diseases is that we have an excellent safety profile of the cells, so that we know that these cells, when put into the brains of animals and in patients to date, haven't shown any evidence of causing abnormal growth, such as tumors, or cause any side effects like the dyskinesias they were seeing in the Parkinson's patients or the movement disorders. So what's very exciting also is that another lab working with mouse brain stem cells, they put them into a model for Alzheimer's disease and shown that these mouse neurostem cells can protect and delay the onset of Alzheimer's in mice. So one of the collaborations we had initiated with George and his lab is to look at what our cells did in the context of the Alzheimer's models that he has, and have shown that the human cells can survive in this environment that is riddled with plaques. And I think that's the first step to show that, you know, these plaques won't kill the newly transplanted cells. And so we hope to continue this work. There are other Alzheimer's models, and what we'd like to show is that by transplanting these human neural stem cells, just like the studies that were done with mouse cells, that the cells produce either factors or various proteins that are going to protect the cells that are resident in the brain from dying. And they've shown this with mouse brain stem cells into mice, and we are gearing up in collaborations to hopefully demonstrate that these human neural stem cells are able to do the same in the Alzheimer's models. In the disease called Batten's disease, we transplanted these human neural stem cells, and in the area of the brain called the hippocampus that I've talked about, which is involved in new memory formation, we're showing that the injection of these cells into that area of the brain was able to protect those resident host nerve cells from dying. So in the control animals that didn't receive a transplant, they were they had less than 8% of their cells surviving. And in the animals that received these human neural stem cells, over 60% of the cells survived long-term after transplant. So these were some of the key work that's being done in George's lab and others, could help move the field and bridge stem cells into the world of Alzheimer's. Thank you.
Are there any questions? One question.
Well, after Ann was talking about the possibilities in research eventually hitting the patients who have the disease, do you feel that the statistics that Barry gave us are overwhelming as far as, you know, the number of people we're going to have to deal with Alzheimer's? Does that indeed can be increased significantly by the research, I mean, before in the next 40 years?
So one of the challenges is that in our first clinical trial, so we found the human neural stem cell in 1999. We filed our first, what they call investigational new drug application in late 2005. And the FDA put us on clinical hold, which means we couldn't go forward because they weren't convinced that there was enough safety data in the animals. So we had to go back to the drawing board and do more studies. We've transplanted over 3,000 mice to date. The second trial, and I should back up, and they would only let us go into terminally ill patients so that there's nothing to protect in those children's brains. It was much like the brain that George showed where there was very significant degeneration and brain cell loss. So if your strategy is to protect the cells that are resident in the brain and there's nothing to protect, you're not going to show a clinical benefit. So then moving to the next trial, they said, okay, but you have to show us some measure of efficacy from your first trial before you can move to the second trial. Well, how can you show that if they made you go into a population where there's nothing to protect? And what I know from other studies that we have planned in other disease areas, it's the same thing. For the treating the eye, you have to have no vision before they'll let you transplant that eye. So you're not going to protect anything. So that is some of our challenges and frustrations because it's a very, very cautious agency because they don't know about the cells. And there are a lot of people who are who are doing things to patients with no sound scientific data behind it and no safety data. They're just clinicians who are saying, I have a stem cell treatment, it's in vogue now, I'm going to do something, and they're harming patients. So that's the balance that has to go on, that we have to do all of the checklist of items that the agency requires to know that they feel confident we're doing the right thing and not putting patients at risk, balanced against those who are doing harm who are not regulated.
Last question. Dee Dee.
Primate testing. At the next stage from mice to primates,
That's the traditional route, I think, as Irv can attest. But it's I think the mouse work is getting to be so good, especially when you're starting to use human cells, that you can skip that test.
Yes, so
testing in the primates.
The agency is not requesting non-human primate studies necessarily. It really depends on your individual disease target and what you're testing and how you're trying to deliver it.
Because that would add years and years in between the discovery and the treatment. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, especially Barry Petersen and Mary Nell. And as we said, Jan's story is available in the hospital gift shop, which is right down the corridor, and then right upstairs is a reception where you'll have a chance to talk with Barry and have some refreshments.